Welcome to Spiritual Dialogues with Father Odon de Castro. We are here at Cariana Lay Monastery Community. I'm your host, Brother Lodi, and with us is Sister Tachi.
Yes, Father, the last episode we had was on canonization. Did you want to continue regarding that thing?
Yes, in this next 3 or 4 programs, we're going to discuss one of the most common sin in the whole world called willful ignorance. It is a common sin, but nobody is conscious about it. Nobody knows it is a sin. Nobody is obeying it. Most of the people are disobeying it, are committing this kind of sin. It is so prevalent that St. Thomas of Aquin says it's one of the sins that can cause many people to go to hell. He describes it as a damning sin, a sin that damns the soul, that brings the soul to hell. And this is now very common in the whole world, especially in the Catholic Church, and especially among the hierarchy. This willful ignorance. It's ignorant, but it's willful.
Can you explain further this willful ignorance? Ignorance of what?
Yes, ignorance in general is not a sin, ignorance. Like, for instance, you, Brother Lodi, you do not know how to cook a good steak.
Yes,
That's
Father.
ignorance, but that's not serious. That's not a sin. Ignorance is a defect. It's better for you to know how to cook a good steak than not. It is a defect, but it's not a sin. In general, it's not a sin. It becomes a sin when you're ignorant of how to go to heaven.
Supposing we do not know how to the process of going to heaven, who will tell us? Who will teach us?
That's why it's called willful ignorance. Meaning to say, you know how to go to heaven,
But you did not do it.
but you don't do it or you don't want it. Yeah. Or you are rejecting it. Yeah.
So there is no ignorance at all. You know, or is it could it also be you don't know and you don't want to find out?
It is still called ignorance because it works this way. Let's look at the Jewish people in the Old Testament. They had the best preachers. The prophets were the best preachers among the Jews. The Jews could hear what the preacher was saying. It was very clear. Like say Jonah was preaching, they could hear the preaching of Jonah. It was very clear to the listeners. So it entered their ears, it went into their mind, and it even went down into their free will. And so they obeyed the preaching of the prophets in the Old Testament. In willful ignorance, you hear the words, like the Pharisees, they would hear the words of Christ. It's very clear. They understand it in their minds, but it is rejected by the free will. Rejected by the free will. And when the free will rejects something, the free will tend to drive it away. He drives it away from the free will, he drives it away from the mind. Because it comes from the free will, it's called willful. And because he drives it out of his mind, it's called ignorance because it's no longer there in the mind.
Yes, Father.
So willful ignorance. So in effect, you were right. They know it. They heard it, but they rejected it.
Because they do not believe on what the prophet says. Is that it?
The free will rejected it.
Oh, I see.
The mind accepted it, but the free will rejected it.
So there is conflict between the mind and the free will. What seems to be the conflict between the mind and the free will?
The conflict between the mind and the free will is the result of original sin. Before, the mind and the free will were were always united. They always agreed with each other. They always agreed. But when Adam and Eve fell and committed original sin, the punishment that God gave them was the intellect and the free will would always fight. They would always be in conflict with one another.
That seems to be a test whether you will follow your free will and then your mind. Would it become a test for man?
It could be a form of test, yeah. It could be a form of test. Yeah.
It seems to be a perennial struggle, Father.
It has been a perennial struggle. That's why it's very common in the Catholic Church today, what you call willful ignorance. And during these 4 programs we're going to give many examples of what is happening in the Catholic Church today because of this willful ignorance. And one of them is the process of canonization.
I see. Okay.
Would you say that when you read the Bible, the Word of God, you have read it, it is in your mind, but somehow your free will reject that
Yeah.
kind of, is that it? That's a willful ignorance.
Yeah. In other words, whatever enters your mind is not always approved by the free will. Yeah.
How
Yeah.
come, Father?
Well, because of original sin. It's a punishment God has given mankind.
So just for clarification, Father, so what would be the other kind of ignorance is the one that you don't know at all?
Well, the other
Is there
kind
such
of
a way? Is there such a...
well, yes, the ignorance which is not sinful, like you do not know who is going to win the basketball
no,
game
but
tomorrow.
in the spiritual
no.
life though.
In
There's
the
no such thing.
spiritual life, when there is, it pertains to the salvation of the soul. No ignorance is allowed.
That's what I wanted
No
to know.
ignorance is
No excuse.
tolerable. Yeah,
Okay.
cannot be.
Okay.
And that's where it becomes a sin, which Saint Thomas of Aquinas, in his treatise on Summa Theologica, they call it Prima Secunda, says that it is a very serious sin. It is a damnable sin, which means if you commit it, you cannot go to heaven. You go surely to hell.
I think about what Jesus Christ said to the disciple. Make all nation my disciple. Teach them the things that I taught you. That is a sign that you have to follow what Christ or what the disciples said, so that is a
Yeah.
process of going to heaven.
Yeah, in other words, when Christ told the disciples to go to all nations, baptize them, and preach them all my commands and how to obey them, Christ was telling the hierarchy, the bishops, the pope, and the priests, precisely to teach you so you would not be ignorant of the way to go to heaven. But if you notice, at the time when Christ was himself preaching, and the Jewish people could hear very clearly what was the teaching.
Yes.
Very clear were the teachings and the commandments of Christ. And in spite of the fact that they heard it very clearly, they rejected Christ's teaching. Which means you could be hearing it, you have a knowledge of it, but you willfully rejected it. The punishment of which is when you reject it, you become ignorant of it.
Okay. So there is always that that you hear it. That's one of the.
Yes,
It
yeah.
has to. You must hear it.
You must hear it. Yeah.
Okay.
So this is a sin that is committed only by those who have heard
Okay.
the
That's clear.
preaching of Christ. Yeah.
Okay. Okay, that's clear, Father.
So that for us lay people, we need the correct teaching of the bishop, those people in authority.
Yeah, it has to be the right teaching. Otherwise, if you get it wrong, then it is equivalent to being ignorant of the teaching of Christ. Yeah.
And then another thing, Father, and if you don't hear it because the people who are supposed to say it or to teach it do not teach it, then there's a double for the one not teaching it too.
Well, just in case the Pope or the bishops or the priests are not teaching it
Yes, for
right,
example, not.
which is what is happening today. The first comment that we have is that when bishops and priests today do not teach it, they are already guilty of willful ignorance because they studied it in the seminary
Yes, Father.
and they have textbooks on how to teach the teachings of Christ. They have internet, they have books, they have professors with whom to talk to. How come they are ignorant? Meaning to say, they really could know it, but they are willfully choosing not to know it.
Which makes double sin on their part. Theirs
It
and
is
mine.
very
Because
serious
they're not
sin.
theirs and the ones like me. If I don't hear it, because they did not
Yeah.
teach it. Right, Father?
Because as Christ says, Sodom and Gomorrah
Yeah.
will receive a lighter sentence than Sidon and Tyre. Because in the case of Sodom and Gomorrah, they have not listened to the teachings of Christ. Because Christ was not yet born during
Yes,
the
that's
time
right.
of Sodom and Gomorrah. While Sidon and Tyre have heard the teachings of Christ and they have rejected it. Upon rejecting the teachings of Christ, they became ignorant of it, but their ignorance is willful. And so their punishment, as Tachi is saying, their punishment is going to be very serious.
Seemingly, Father, that what we should learn is a very simple thing, like what Christ said. But somehow there is some kind of hidden meaning in the word of Christ.
Yeah, that's why it's not simple really to learn the teachings of Christ. It's really quite difficult. And you have to learn how to do it. And this has been the defect in the whole world today, that the way it's being taught is wrong. So most people do not understand the teaching of Christ. They're ignorant. But their ignorance is not yet willful. So as the question of Tachi a moment ago, like Tachi and you, Brother Lodin, you have not heard the teachings of Christ as you should have heard it. Because most of the people you listen to do not know the interpretation of the scriptures as taken from the fathers of the church.
Yes, Father.
Now let's say I tell you too that, okay, now you're ignorant. But now you can go to the writings of the fathers of the church. You can go to St. Thomas of Aquinas and study his commentary on the gospel. And I have told you that. And let's say you don't do it.
That's neglection. That's neglect.
That's the
It
willful.
becomes willful.
Willful, yes.
It becomes willful. Now your ignorance is willful. You don't know it because you did not study it. Though I told you, go
Okay, that's
to the commentary of St. Thomas of Aquinas on the gospel. And that's what's happening to the priests and the bishops. They can learn what is the truth. They can know it. They're not supposed to be ignorant of the truth. But they're ignorant. How come? It's willful.
Some people might say the teaching of the writings of St. Thomas Aquinas and other fathers of the church are deep and most likely will not be able to get the real meaning of what they have written. How's that, Father?
The writings of St. Thomas of Aquinas and Robert Bellarmine, John Chrysostom, all of these fathers of the church are only deep for those who are willful, to those who are proud. But they're not deep for those who are humble, who go after the will of God rather than their own personal will. It's not deep at all.
We have only 30 seconds, Father.
So, in the next program, we are going to deal with the canonization process because Pope Francis has recently canonized. He has canonized many already, but recently the 7 people were canonized by Pope Francis, and he did not follow the proper procedure. In other words, those people were canonized based on willful ignorance, in an ignorant manner, and therefore it is doubtful if these people are really saints. And that's what we're going to discuss next. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Father. Thank you for watching Spiritual Dialogues with Father Udon de Castro. Father Udon will continue explaining this process of canonization and other things related to living in heaven with God. Thank you very much.
Hosanna, Hosanna, in excelsis, Hosanna.